Welcome to the latest episode of the Real World Nutrition Podcast. This is episode 233, Low-Carb and No-Carb Diets, what they get right and what they miss. Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Real World Nutrition. I'm Shelly Ryell, registered dietitian nutritionist, and this is an episode that's part of an ongoing series about carbohydrates. And I've said this before, I'll say it over and over again. As long as I've been a dietitian, carbohydrates have been so misunderstood. So that's why over the past several weeks in the podcast, as well as a couple months back on the blog, I've covered topics about carbohydrates, from what they actually are, breaking down fiber, starch, sugar, looking at what is meant by net carbs, addressing sugar and the idea of sugar addiction, and then most recently, how carbohydrates relate to chronic disease. That would be including diabetes, heart disease, and certain cancers. So today, I want to talk about something that is often thrown around, or a topic, I should say, or a phrase that's often thrown around, low carb and even no carb diets. And more specifically, as I said in the title, what they get right, where they fall short, and why this topic is much more nuanced than it's made out to be. So, as I've mentioned multiple times, there's a blog post that goes with this episode. I shouldn't say this time. I mention this almost every episode, that I have a blog that goes with the episode. So that is linked in the show notes. And if you go to that blog, it also has the rest of the series on carbohydrates on the blog. And then with regard to this podcast feed, if you just scroll back or look back at the last 6, 7 episodes, it covers all those different topics I was mentioning. So with that, let's talk about this. What does low carb even mean? So I want to start with this because this is something that surprises people. There is no single agreed upon definition of what low carb actually means. Because we do have definitions of low fat, and we do have definitions of other types of nutrients. But what does low carb mean? Well, this is where things get challenging because it's different for different people. For some, that means cutting out bread, pasta, rice, and potatoes. For others, that could include avoiding fruit even. And for some, it can go even further into eliminating pretty much all plant foods. Then there are the people who are counting grams, and aiming for a specific number. So many grams of carbohydrates a day. And sometimes when I talk to somebody about what they're eating, what they're calling low carb is actually within the standard of nutrition recommendations. So before I even want to evaluate whether a low carb diet is helpful or not, I need to acknowledge that we may not be talking about the same thing. What somebody else is calling low carb, I'm calling appropriate ranges. So I want to address what that is from a science perspective. So from a nutrition standpoint, carbohydrates are one of the 3 macronutrients along with protein and fat. And I know I've covered this in other episodes, but in case you haven't listened to those, I want to cover that here. So with these macronutrients, carbohydrates, protein, and fat, we have something that we call acceptable macronutrient distribution range, or AMDR. And this gives us evidence-based strategies, or evidence-based ranges rather, for how much of each macronutrient is appropriate and supports overall health. So I emphasize that each one is a range. So the AMDR for carbohydrates falls between 45 and 65% of total calories. Protein ranges from 10 to 35%, and fat from 20 to 35%. And I want to make this clear, we can't exceed 100%. So I've had people who are like, well, I'm going to do 65% carb, 35% protein, and 35% fat. That's not how it works. We adjust the ranges for each of those so the total is 100%. So it takes some tweaking. And there's no exact target. These, again, are ranges. Intakes vary from day to day. Recommendations are adjusted based on individual needs, based on disease risk, activity level, so many factors. So just using a 2,000 calorie diet as an example or for illustration, 50% of a 2,000 calorie diet would be from carbohydrates, would be 1,000 calories from carbohydrates, or about 250 grams per day. And that number tends to surprise people, especially if they've been told that's too high. 50% of calories from carbohydrates is appropriate, and for some people, that's considered low carb. They just don't do the math on that. But what that amount sits, I should say with that amount, that 50% is right in the middle of the evidence-based recommendations, or not exactly the middle. It's 45 to 65%. Most people don't need that 65% unless they're highly active individuals. Or they could be vegan and they're higher in carbohydrate just because of how their food choices measure out. And again, that 50% or half the calories from carbohydrates is right there within the AMTR. So when does low carb become very low? So let's talk about what many people are actually doing, or at least say they're doing. So some people aim for fewer than 100 grams of carbohydrates per day, and that's already well below the recommended range. Others will go even lower, sometimes down to 50 grams a day, 30 grams, or even 20 grams a day. And this is where that would involve tracking what I previously addressed, the net carbs. So they'll track these grams, but it's not straight carbohydrate grams. They do the little nifty math that goes with net carbs. And again, just to make this clear, we don't recognize net carbs as a category in nutrition science. And here's another very, very important thing that most people aren't aware of, that the minimum recommendation for carbohydrate intake is 130 grams per day. And that's based on the brain's glucose needs. So what that means is if we're not getting 130 grams per day and our brain needs that glucose, if we do this consistently, the body has a backup method or alternative pathways to make glucose, and that includes breaking down protein to meet energy needs. There's a small amount of fat that will be used, but the interesting part is when people are doing this part where they're going low carb because they want to burn fat, it's not taking from the body's fat stores. It will take from the dietary fat to work on fuel. And fat does not produce a good amount of glucose. It's actually a very small portion of it that can make glucose. So short way of saying here, if you're not getting that minimum of 130 grams of carbohydrates per day, your body will work on getting glucose from an alternative source, which is protein. And our protein in our body is our lean tissue, muscle, including the heart. So why do people say, well, going low carb works? I hear that all the time. People are like, oh, low carb worked for me. Well, the first question I ask is, what do you mean by worked? What was your goal? Because I make no assumptions here. Now, it turns out most people are talking about weight loss, but sometimes it refers to changes in their blood sugar or changes in their appetite. Now, weight loss on a low carb diet is not surprising. When we reduce carbohydrates or cut back on carbohydrates or cut them out, which is really not usually possible, glycogen stores are depleted. So that's the storage form of glucose. And glycogen has an entourage of water. So I just say it's glycogen holds onto water. So when glycogen is depleted, when we don't have any stored glycogen, the water goes away too. So that weight drop that happens when people go low carb It's water. It's water weight. And this shows up on the scale almost immediately. So that's when people say it works. Yeah, I lost weight and then I gained weight when I cut out carbs and then brought them back in. It wasn't the carbs. It was the water that accompanies carbohydrate and stored glycogen. And at the same time, calorie intake will often decrease because when we cut out entire food groups, there's fewer options. That means fewer calories, especially in the short term. So just to recap here, carbohydrates are found in food of plant origin as well as dairy products. So when we cut out grains and fruits and vegetables and beans, nuts, seeds, and dairy, because if people are cutting out carbohydrates, all those things go. There's fewer options. And then, as I said as well, when carbohydrates are reintroduced, because for most people this is not sustainable, that glycogen and water are restored and the weight returns. It's not fat. It's the weight gain is not real. I mean, it's real. It's real changes. But when we're talking water weight, that's not what most people want. So this whole depleting of glycogen and the fluid loss, and then the reintroduction of carbohydrates and the stored glycogen and the fluid returning, leads to this belief that carbohydrates are the problem when the real issue was an approach that just wasn't sustainable. Now let's talk about some of the other things that say it works for them is the blood sugar and misconceptions about that. And I did talk about carbohydrates and diabetes last week, or in the last episode, but low-carb diets are often promoted for blood sugar control. And of course, if somebody has diabetes, carbohydrate intake does matter. But management of diabetes is not eliminating carbohydrates entirely. That's not the standard of care. It's not how diabetes is treated long term. It shouldn't even be how diabetes is treated short term. And for individuals without diabetes, checking blood sugar constantly is generally unnecessary. It can lead to more stress than useful insight. I've seen people who are freaking out by their blood glucose going to 120 after they've eaten. And hello, this is normal. For all of us as a human, our blood glucose goes up after we eat and then it goes back down. That's part of metabolism. So having these continuous glucose monitoring, especially for individuals who don't have diabetes, can be just it'd be frustrating if people don't understand how the human body works. Now, there is short-term appeal with low-carbohydrate diets, and that's why they come back over and over again, or they're just constantly being talked about. Because in the short term, cutting back carbohydrate can contribute to a reduced appetite, simplify food choices. When you take away all those foods, there's fewer options. And as I've said, can lead to quick changes in weight. And that can feel motivating. But those short-term results are not the same as long-term sustainability and not the same as changing body weight or body composition in a healthy way. So what's the long-term reality here? Over time, these diets can become difficult to maintain. Now, I've had people who say, oh no, I've done low carb for decades, for years. Good for you. But let's talk about this. Eliminating or significantly reducing fruits, whole grains, beans, vegetables means missing out on fiber, vitamins, minerals, and other beneficial compounds found in plant foods. Again, I can say this all the time till I'm blue in the face. Carbohydrates are found in plant foods. So if we are eliminating carbohydrates altogether, we're eliminating all plant foods. And there is strong, consistent evidence supporting the benefits of these foods for long-term health. This is indisputable. Plant foods help with long-term health on so many levels. And low intake of these foods can impact gut health, make social situations more challenging, although some people, when they say they're going low or no carb, they don't really care about the social part, at least the ones I've encountered. But we have to remember, food is not just nutrients. It's culture, it's connection, it's experience. Many of us socialize with food. We have holidays with food. We get together for whatever reason around food. So that's just part of human experience, is eating together. So I said at the beginning in the title, what low-carb diets get right. There are some things that are good with low-carb diets, but let me make this very clear. It often can or will reduce intake of refined carbohydrates and added sugars, and that aligns with general nutrition guidance. Reducing refined carbohydrates, minimizing added sugars is long-term. This is not new. We want this to be a goal for most people as it relates to nutrition. And then going low carbohydrate will often increase awareness of protein intake and encourage less reliance on highly processed foods. Not always, but often. And these aren't bad things. These aren't bad outcomes. Increasing awareness of where these different nutrients come from is great. But what do they miss? Where these diets tend to fall short is treating carbohydrates as one single category. I say this constantly. Carbohydrates are a nutrient, not a food group. This was like one of the first 5 episodes of Real World Nutrition where I have that topic. Fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans, lentils, nuts, and seeds are very different from soda, candy, and baked goods. They're not interchangeable. And that may seem obvious, but some people do put some of these in the same category. Fruits are bad, whole grains are bad. No, they are not. Carbohydrates are the body's preferred energy source. They support brain function, muscle activity, overall energy needs. Carbohydrates fuel every cell in the body. And removing them entirely ignores basic human physiology. And no matter how adamant somebody may be on social media that we don't need them, that is objectively untrue. So let's talk about real-world approaches here. For most people, the goal is not to be low carb or no carb. It needs to be balanced. That includes keeping fruits and vegetables in your routine, including whole grains, using beans and lentils regularly, adding nuts and seeds. And if weight or blood sugar is a concern, focusing on portion sizes, overall intake, and food quality is far more effective than eliminating an entire macronutrient. At the end of the day, balance, consistency matter more than a low-carb number that goes on paper. So, if you want to read more about this, if you want to just review this more, go ahead and head to the blog post that I've linked in the show notes here, along with the rest of the carbohydrate series. I didn't link every single one in the show notes, but like I said, it's in the podcast feed, or when you go to that link in the show notes, all the other ones are linked as well. And if you have questions about this, message me, let me know what you have questions about with carbohydrates. If you haven't listened to the previous episodes, it's a great place to continue building context around this topic. All right, everyone. Thanks for being here this week, and take care, and bye for now.